The rain began before the verdict, soft at first, just a whisper against the courthouse glass. But even then it carried weight, like a hand pressing down on the shoulder of time, reminding me I'd already lost. The air inside smelled of damp wool, old wood, and faint cologne, the scent of men who decide things. Light fell through high windows, gray and trembling dust floating like forgotten confessions. I sat there with Wuthering Heights in my hands. Its cover frayed the paper thin as breath. I used to tell my students that books could keep you warm. But that day I learned paper burns faster than hope. Across the room, Jonathan adjusted his tie. My sister Eleanor kept her gloves on. 3 lawyers sat between us like walls. The judge's gavel hit once, then again, each strike louder than thunder. He spoke of mental instability, inability to manage property, and family's concern for her well-being. Jonathan's voice followed, smooth and cold. Dee no longer has the clarity to care for what others can grow. Not once did he look at me. His words sliced through the room, clean and practiced, as if love could be rewritten by legal language. For a moment I thought I saw my reflection in the window, a pale woman clutching a book, still believing family meant safety. Then it was done. The gavel fell a final time. The house under the wisteria mine no longer. When I stepped outside, the world had turned to water. Rain poured from the gray sky, rolling down my face, my hands, my memories. The courthouse loomed behind me, its stone walls bleeding with centuries of other people's verdicts. I held my old leather bag close inside it, the house key, a handkerchief, and a half-broken pen. Everything else was gone. The umbrella I carried had one bent rib, and I remember thinking how much it looked like me. Bent, but still trying to hold back the storm. I started walking. No destination, just movement, as if walking might undo the sound of the gavel still echoing in my head. The street smelled of wet leaves and rust. Cars hissed by. Some slowed to stare an old woman in the rain, carrying what was left of her life. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a whisper, a sound too soft to be heard above the downpour. Silence remembers. And it did. Every promise, every betrayal, every unspoken sorry. Eleanor had been my sister, my mirror, my shadow. We grew up reading under that wisteria tree, 2 girls dreaming of the world beyond Vermont, but the years had turned her sharp. She learned to survive by forgetting, and I learned to endure by remembering. The last time we spoke before the trial, she'd said, "It's just paperwork, Margaret. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her smile was thin, rehearsed. That's when I should have known the softest voices can hide the deepest knives. Jonathan, my nephew, once drew me pictures of birds when he was small. He'd leave them on my desk after class, always writing, "Only special people get wings, Aunt Maggie." I used to believe him, but maybe those words were never meant for me. Now he had my home and I had the rain. As I reached the end of the street, the fog began to lift, and in the distance I could almost see it, the old Whitmore house. The roof sagged like an old man's spine, the shutters loose, the wisteria hanging heavy and purple over the porch. It looked asleep, or waiting. For 40 years that house was my world. I'd baked bread there, buried my dog beneath the lilac tree, and kept every student's thank you note in a drawer by the window. I'd thought love was enough to protect a place, but love, it seems, does not sign deeds or pay lawyers. Still, I whispered to it through the rain, "I'm sorry." And for a moment I swore I felt the wisteria move, as if it remembered me too. By dusk, I found myself at the park by the river. The benches were slick with rain. The air was heavy, smelling of iron and moss. I sat. The water rushed by, dark and relentless, just like time. I thought about justice, how we speak of it like it's a virtue, but in truth, it's a privilege. Justice belongs to those who can afford patience or lawyers. The rest of us get silence. I traced the edge of the book in my lap, the ink smudged where my fingers met the page. For a second, I could almost hear my students' laughter, their young voices asking questions about morality and truth. I used to tell them that doing right would always matter, but now I wasn't sure. Maybe the world isn't divided into right and wrong. Maybe it's divided into those who speak and those who are silenced. If you've ever been silenced, you know the weight it leaves behind, that echo that never really fades. If you felt it too, tell me below. The rain slowed. The sky began to pale. I could see my reflection trembling in the river hair, silver face-lined eyes, still searching for something that could not be named. I whispered again, "Silence remembers," and the words floated away, carried downstream with everything else I'd lost. For a moment, I imagined the house again, its windows glowing with evening light, the scent of wisteria drifting through the halls. I could almost hear the piano, the one I used to play when the world still felt kind. Would you have done the same? I asked the river, the rain, the silence itself. No one answered, but somehow that was enough. When I finally stood, the clouds had thinned. A faint gold light touched the wet pavement, turning every puddle into a small mirror. I walked slowly, each step a little steadier than the one before. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a flicker, not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest pulse of life returning. Heat. I thought of Jonathan's words again, his calm, his certainty, his cruelty, and for the first time I didn't feel pain. I felt distance, the kind that sets you free. The courthouse stood behind me, swallowed by mist. Ahead the road stretched quiet and long, and I realized this was not the end. It was the pause between storms. The rain began again, lighter now, almost tender. It touched my hair like an apology, and I whispered to no one I never thought the one I trusted most would take everything from me on a day like this. Drops rolled down my face, cold and clean. Justice, I thought, is the most expensive luxury for the old. Then I turned towards the sound of the wisteria and walked on, because silence remembers. And so do I. The river never sleeps. It keeps whispering beneath the bridge, a restless black mirror reflecting whatever's left of the sky. That night I lay there wrapped in a coat that smelled of rain and time. The wood above me was swollen with water, each droplet falling like the tick of a broken clock. I pressed my hand against the earth, cold, damp, alive. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then stopped. Silence, and then the faint sound of a piano. Claire de Lune. It drifted through the fog like a memory refusing to die. That melody had once played from my classroom record player on days when I made children write about beauty. Now it played for no one, just an old woman hiding under a bridge with nowhere left to belong. I thought of Jonathan then, his sharp suit, his unshakable calm, the way he said I was unfit. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd lost my mind the day I believed family could be kind. I looked up through the slats of the bridge, watching drops of light fall from passing cars. They flickered across the river, small trembling halos. If you've ever been forgotten, you'll know those tiny lights feel like forgiveness trying to find you. Hours passed before I heard footsteps, soft ones. Careful. I stiffened. The river hummed louder. A flashlight cut through the rain. Then a voice, calm, feminine, uncertain. Mrs. Whitmore. For a moment I didn't breathe. No one had said my name with kindness in weeks. She stepped closer. Young, maybe 30, brown coat mud on her boots. Her face glowed faintly in the flashlight's halo, tired but gentle. "I've been looking for you," she said. Her voice trembled at the edges. "I'm Evelyn Cross. I was asked to find you." I blinked. My throat tightened. "Find me," I whispered. "Why?" She knelt holding something, an envelope sealed with red wax, its surface cracked like old porcelain. "There's a message for you," she said softly. "Someone left it before he passed away." My hand shook as I took it. The wax seal bore a faint imprint, AG. The initials caught in my breath. Alan Gray. I hadn't spoken that name in 40 years. Alan was the only man who ever saw me before I became invisible. He used to say, "Only special people find beauty in small things." He'd bring me lilacs from the school garden, and we'd argue about poetry, him quoting Yeats, me defending Bronte. He left town to become a doctor. I stayed to become a ghost. Now under a bridge his name found me again. Evelyn watched me as I broke the seal. Inside was a single line written in ink faded to sepia. "I kept my promise to you, Alan Gray." That was all. No explanation, no goodbye. Just the weight of a man's word reaching across time. My vision blurred. The sound of the river grew louder, as if it understood the ache of unfinished stories. Evelyn touched my shoulder. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's more. He left property in your name. A house, a trust fund. He said you'd understand." I wanted to laugh, but the sound that came out was half sob, half disbelief. "After all these years," I whispered. He still remembered. She nodded. "I was told to find you and give you that." Then her voice softened. "He said you were the only one who ever believed in him." Silence. Only the rain answered, tapping like a heartbeat against the river's skin. I looked down at the letter again. Alan's handwriting, neat, disciplined, familiar. He'd written me dozens of letters once, back when he was stationed overseas, and I was still grading essays by candlelight. I never wrote back. I thought duty meant silence, and now silence had remembered returning in the shape of a sealed envelope in the hands of a stranger. My fingers brushed the wax seal again. It was rough, imperfect. I pressed it to my heart. You see, when you lose everything, even a small act of remembering can save your life. That night I realized I wasn't just forgotten, I was being called back. Evelyn handed me a thermos. "Drink this, it's still warm. Tea, weak, sweet, familiar." The smell carried me back to my classroom again, to mornings when Alan used to bring me breakfast he swore he cooked himself. He never could fry eggs without burning them. I sipped slowly. Heat spread through my chest, not just from the tea, from something older, deeper, the heat of being seen again. Evelyn smiled faintly. "You can come with me," she said. "You shouldn't be here." I wanted to say no, that I didn't deserve rescue, but her voice had the same cadence as mine once did, soft but sure, the tone of a woman who hadn't yet learned that kindness can cost you everything. So I stood. My knees cracked, my coat dripped, and for the first time in days I felt the ground beneath me. We walked in silence. The rain eased into mist. Each step echoed against the wooden planks, steady and slow, like the rhythm of two hearts carrying the same secret. When we reached her car, I turned back. The bridge looked smaller now, the place that had held my despair shrinking behind fog. I whispered, "Thank you, Alan, for remembering." Evelyn turned confused. I smiled weakly. Just something an old teacher used to say. If you've ever had someone remember you after the world erased your name, you'll understand what that moment felt like. Would you have cried too, or just stood there letting the rain hide it for you? Share this if you believe silence deserves a voice. Later that night, Evelyn drove in quiet. The radio played softly, another piano piece, each note falling like light rain on glass. I closed my eyes. The letter rested on my lap, and I could still hear Alan's voice. Only special people find beauty in small things. He had been right. Even in the smallest, wettest corner of a forgotten town, beauty had found me again. The road curved, and through the windshield, I saw the faint glow of a house on a hill. Its windows lit its silhouette, surrounded by vines that hung like purple smoke. Wisteria. I didn't know it yet, but that house would give me back my truth, and maybe a second chance at being alive. The rain began again, gentle, forgiving. It followed us up the hill, singing softly against the glass, as if blessing the road ahead. I touched the letter once more and whispered, "I slept beneath the bridge my student once wrote a poem about. Only this time I was the one the world forgot." The river kept flowing behind us, and in the hush that followed, I could almost hear Alan's voice again, low and sure, saying what I needed most to remember. Silence remembers. And tonight, so did I. The morning came gray and soundless. Mist rose from the wet road as Evelyn's car wound through the trees, each branch heavy with rain. The world smelled of pine and old earth, the kind of scent that holds secrets. I sat in silence, my hands folded over the envelope from the night before. The wax seal was gone now, but its warmth still lingered in my palm, as if Alan's hand had just left mine. When we reached the lawyer's office in Montpellier, the building looked like it hadn't breathed in decades. Dark wood, dusty windows, a ticking clock that never hurried. And there, among papers and signatures, I heard his name again, Dr. Alan Gray. The sound of it felt like a heartbeat I'd forgotten was mine. Evelyn sat beside me, reading aloud in a voice too young for words that heavy. Dr. Alan Gray leaves his estate, a house on Montpelier Hill, and a trust of $15 million to Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. On one condition. She paused, looking at me. I nodded for her to continue. She must live in the house for 100 days. During that time, she is to uncover the forgotten truth buried in the history of the Whitmore family. Should she fail or abandon the task, all property and funds will revert to the Maple Haven Nursing Foundation. The room held its breath. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. I whispered, Why would he do that? Evelyn turned the final page. He wrote one more note. It says, "Because she's the only one brave enough to face the truth." Only one line, but it broke something open inside me. Alan Gray. He had always believed I was braver than I ever felt. He once said, "Only special people look straight at the dark." I never knew if that was a compliment or a warning. Back then, I thought I was just a woman surviving small cruelties, a father who favored silence, a sister who learned how to twist truth until it shone her way. But maybe Alan saw what I refused to see, that courage isn't loud. It's the choice to keep walking when no one calls your name. I looked at the lawyer, a tired man behind round glasses. He asked if I accepted the terms. His pen hovered above the line. For a long time, I didn't answer. The air felt thick, and I could almost hear Alan's voice, that slow, careful tone he used when talking about the things people hide from themselves. I signed. The pen scraped softly, and in that sound, something shifted. A life I thought was ending began to move again. When we stepped outside, the sun was struggling to break through the clouds. Light touched the wet pavement, and for a moment it felt like the world exhaled. Evelyn smiled, though I could see questions in her eyes. "Do you know what he meant by the forgotten truth?" I shook my head. "Every family has its ghosts. Ours just learned to dress better." She laughed softly, the sound like a bird trying to sing in the rain. It had been a long time since anyone had laughed near me without cruelty. I asked her quietly, "Why are you helping me, Evelyn?" She looked down. "My mother was one of your students," she said. "She used to say you taught her that words could heal." I swallowed hard. That was a lifetime ago, before my own words turned against me. As we drove toward the hill, the fog thinned and revealed the outline of a house. Stone walls, tall windows, a balcony smothered in vines that glistened like silver threads in the light. It looked both haunted and holy, and something in me, something half-broken, stirred. That was when Evelyn parked and handed me another envelope. "This came with the will," she said. "Alan asked me to give it to you after you signed." The paper was thick, the ink faint but elegant. Inside there was no letter, only a photograph. It was me standing under the wisteria at the Whitmore house wearing a pink dress I'd sewn myself for a summer recital. Alan had taken it when we were both too young to know that time would turn us into strangers. On the back in his handwriting, "The truth waits in the roots." I felt the heat rise behind my eyes, not from grief this time, but from something deeper. A call to remember. That night, Evelyn left me at a small inn at the edge of town. She said she'd return in the morning to drive me to the house. When the door closed, I sat on the bed and stared at the photograph. The girl in that pink dress looked fearless, but I knew better. She was just learning how to hide her fear inside grace. I traced the image with my fingertip and whispered, "Alan, what truth did you think I could still bear?" The lamp flickered. Outside, crickets sang an uneven rhythm like a heartbeat that refused to quit. If you've ever been given one last chance when you thought the world had forgotten you, you'll know how terrifying mercy can feel. Would you have taken it or walked away too afraid to find out what you left behind? If you felt that kind of silence, tell me below. Later, I opened the window. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine, and something floral, faint but familiar. Wisteria. Even from miles away, it reached me. And in that moment, I understood what Alan had done. He hadn't just left me a house. He'd left me a path, a trail back through the lies and the quiet. A test, perhaps, a gift maybe, or both. When I finally lay down the letter and photograph beside me, I could almost hear him again, his voice steady, patient, filled with that same impossible faith. Only special people, Margaret. They see the light even in the dark. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel the cold, just heat-soft living human. Morning would come soon enough. 100 days to live in that house, 100 days to face what my family had buried. But that night, as the moonlight spilled across the floor, I felt something I hadn't known since youth, the quiet thrill of purpose returning. And I whispered to the darkness, the man who once believed in me, still does even after death. Then softer like a promise, not a prayer. Only special people remember. The gate creaked before I even touched it. Its rust sang in the misty air, the sound thin as breath. I stood there for a long while, staring at the house that, time-forgot stone walls mottled with moss ivy crawling like green veins, and the wisteria spilling down from the roof in soft purple rivers. The scent hit me first sweet damp, a little wild. It was the smell of every summer I once believed would last forever. Now it felt like a stranger's perfume, faint but haunting. I whispered to no one, "The place they took from me is the one calling me back." The gravel crunched under my steps as I walked up the path. Each sound seemed to echo louder than it should, like the house was listening. Inside, the air was colder, old. You could taste the dust in it, decades of silence layered thick over memory. I closed the door behind me, and the hinges groaned a low, aching voice welcoming me home and warning me at the same time. Light filtered through cracked windows, casting wisteria shadows across the wooden floor. Every step stirred something, the smell of old books, the faint echo of laughter, the creak of a chair long since empty. On the center table sat a small silver music box, its surface dull, but elegant, engraved with a single line, "The truth hums beneath the wisteria." I ran my fingers over the letters. They felt warm, alive somehow. I tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. The keyhole was delicate, shaped like a blooming flower, locked tight like the years between who I was and what I had become. I whispered to the room, "What truth did you hide, Alan?" The only answer was the distant sound of a shutter tapping against the wind. I walked through the house slowly, touching things I'd once owned but no longer remembered. A porcelain lamp, a stack of yellowed sheet music, a cracked mirror reflecting more ghosts than light. In the hallway, I found a coat still hanging on its peg. His coat, Alan's. The smell of cedar clung faintly to the fabric, and for a moment I closed my eyes and let the years fold in on themselves. He had told me once long ago, "Listen, Margaret, houses remember us even when we forget ourselves." Back then I thought he meant nostalgia. Now I knew he was talking about something deeper, the way silence holds on to truth until someone dares to hear it again. By evening I'd swept the dust from the kitchen table and warmed a can of soup on a rusted stove. The spoon trembled in my hand as I ate each bite, tasting more like memory than food. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, tapping against the windows, in rhythm with my heartbeat. After dinner, I ran the bath, the first real bath I'd had in months. The water steamed cloudy and kind. I undressed slowly, watching the bruises on my body from days of sleeping rough fade beneath the heat. It was strange how warmth could hurt after so much cold. I sank deeper, letting the water carry what grief it could. And when I closed my eyes, I could almost hear his voice through the ripples. "Listen to the flowers," he whispered. "They know the truth." I didn't know if it was dream or memory, but either way, I listened. That night, I slept in a real bed again. The sheets smelled of lavender and age. The pillow was heavy with old tears, not mine, but someone's. Outside the window, the wisteria swayed in the moonlight petals, brushing against the glass like fingertips. I dreamed of him. Alan stood under the same wisteria. His coat unbuttoned, his eyes kind and distant, the way they were before time took everything soft from us. He smiled that quiet, certain smile he always had when he knew something I didn't. "Do you hear it, Margaret?" he asked. "The truth. It hums." And behind him I saw the flowers moving their vines, twisting, whispering through the air, as if carrying a secret language made of color and sound. When I woke, the music box sat open beside the bed. I hadn't opened it, but the lid was ajar, and inside a faint melody was playing one single broken line of Clair de Lune. It stopped as soon as I touched it. For a long time I sat there in the dark, listening to the silence fill the room again. It wasn't empty, not anymore. It was watching, breathing, waiting. If you've ever been in a place that knew you better than you knew yourself, you understand that kind of quiet. Would you have listened? Or turned away, afraid of what it might say back? Share this if you believe silence deserves a voice. By morning, light poured through the window in thin golden threads. The wisteria outside shimmered with dew, and for a moment the whole world smelled alive again. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Cold air swept in, wrapping around me like forgiveness. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt awake. I touched the music box one last time and whispered, "I'm here now." A petal drifted in through the open window and landed on my hand, a small, perfect piece of purple. It glowed against my skin, fragile and brave, and I realized this wasn't a house at all. It was a memory made solid, a confession made of walls and vines. The wind moved again through the flowers, carrying a low, familiar hum, the sound of something trying to speak through time. I stepped closer, closing my eyes. Silence remembers. I could feel it in the floorboards, in the air in my bones. Every secret the family buried here was still breathing under the wisteria. I smiled softly and whispered, "The place they took from me is the one that welcomed me home. Only now, I return with another soul." The music box clicked once, the flowers swayed, and the truth still hidden waited beneath the bloom. The afternoon light slanted through the wisteria like thin ribbons of dust and gold. The air smelled of paper ink and time, the scent of secrets waiting to breathe. Evelyn and I had been searching through the study for hours, our fingers tracing the edges of forgotten lives. Every drawer groaned open like a confession. Old receipts, faded letters, birth certificates, and then a folder brittle with age bound by a red string. The year stamped on its corner, 1974. My hand froze. That was the year everything changed, the year my father's health failed, the year our family's fortune mysteriously doubled. Evelyn looked up at me, eyes careful. Do you want me to open it? I nodded, though my voice trembled. Sometimes the past opens itself whether we ask it to or not. The papers inside were yellow and thin edges curled like burned leaves. She spread them across the desk and the sunlight caught the seal of our family's estate, Whitmore Holdings. The first document was a land contract. Date July 12, 1974. Seller Henry Hale. Buyer Robert Whitmore. Price insultingly low. Evelyn frowned. Your father bought land from the Hales. Cheap, too cheap. Her voice softened. There's a note here. It says he forced them to sell after the floods destroyed their crops. I felt the room tilt slightly. My father's handwriting was everywhere, his proud, elegant signature looping across the bottom of each page. But the ink looked wrong. Too steady for a man who could barely hold a pen that year. Evelyn, I whispered. He couldn't have written this. He was bedridden. His hands shook so much he couldn't even sign my report cards. She turned the papers toward me. Are you sure? I traced the signature with my fingertip. It felt foreign, too confident. Something in my chest tightened. That's when I saw it. A small note attached to the last page, Jonathan's handwriting. He had used these documents, this very file, to accuse me in court. To claim I had inherited stolen land. To say our fortune was built on someone else's ruin. The truth hit like a blade. Jonathan wasn't the beginning of betrayal. He was its echo. I thought of Eleanor then, my sister, her calm voice at the trial, the way she avoided my eyes when the verdict was read. It all began before Jonathan, before me, before I ever understood what silence could hide. Evelyn, I said softly, this isn't my father's signature, it's hers. She blinked. Eleanor's. I nodded. She was always the one handling his affairs near the end. She had access to everything, his seals, his ledgers. And she always wanted more. Evelyn exhaled, as if realizing the weight of a story she had just stepped into. She forged it. Yes, I whispered. She forged it, then blamed me for what she'd done. The words left my mouth like poison long trapped under glass. Outside, the wind shifted a soft hum, passed through the wisteria vines, their blossoms swaying as if listening. If you've ever discovered that betrayal runs in your blood, you'll know the silence that follows. Would you have screamed, or just stood there like me letting it settle into your bones? Evelyn's eyes glistened. What will you do with this? I looked down at the papers, the ink that had ruined generations, and I felt something I hadn't in years, heat. Not the kind that burns everything in its path, the kind that melts ice. That wakes you up. For now, I said, I'll keep listening. The house isn't done speaking yet. She nodded, silent. There was nothing more to say. We gathered the papers into a neat stack. But as I tied the red string again, I noticed one more slip tucked beneath the folder. It was a newspaper clipping. A headline, Local Farmer Henry Hale Dies After Forced Eviction. The article said he left behind a wife and a 13-year-old son. A chill went through me. 13. That was my age in 1974. I remembered that year my father's illness. Eleanor's sudden trips, and one rainy afternoon when I saw a boy crying by the fence. He had looked up at me, his face streaked with mud and fury. He shouted, "Your family took our land." I hadn't known what he meant. I ran back inside and told my sister. She smiled and said, "Don't listen to him. He's just angry at the world." But that boy had been right. And all my life I carried a guilt I couldn't name. That night I couldn't sleep. The house breathed around me, settling, whispering, remembering. The wisteria brushed against my window like a hand trying to wake me. I sat up and lit a candle. The flame wavered, small but steady, a light Alan might have approved of. He'd once told me truth doesn't knock, Margaret. It waits until you're brave enough to open the door. I realized that's what this house was doing. Waiting for me to open its door of silence. Waiting for me to see that betrayal isn't born, it's inherited. Passed down like fine china, cracked but polished, until someone finally decides to stop setting the table. I closed my eyes and let the silence fill me. The same silence that once felt like punishment now felt like power. Because silence remembers, and it was remembering everything my family tried to bury. I whispered to the empty room, "Enough." It was a small word, but it tasted like fire on my tongue. Outside, a petal fell from the wisteria and landed on my candle. It didn't burn. It glowed for a moment, soft violet light, then disappeared into smoke. When dawn came, I gathered the papers and sealed them in a drawer. For the first time, I didn't feel small beneath the weight of history. I felt chosen, not for what I'd inherited, but for what I could end. As I walked outside, the air was crisp, almost forgiving. The vines above the door swayed gently, their blossoms humming in the morning wind. And I understood. The lies of the past may bloom for decades, but truth has deeper roots. Sometimes I whispered the ones who betray us are only continuing a lie that began long before them. The wisteria rustled softly as if agreeing, and somewhere inside the house the music box began to hum again, a single trembling note rising through silence, remembering. The cellar door groaned when I pulled it open, a sound like a wound remembering how to ache. The air beneath was heavy, damp, and still. It smelled of rust, wet stone, and forgotten years. I lit a small lamp. Its light quivered across the walls, catching spider webs that shimmered like silver threads of memory. Every step I took stirred the dust, and it rose like ghosts waking from slumber. For days, the house had whispered to me a low hum behind the walls, a quiet pulse beneath the floor. And tonight, I followed it here to the dark beneath everything. That's when I saw it, a small wooden drawer built into the stone foundation, sealed with nails that looked older than sin. I knelt down my knees, pressing against the cold earth, and pried it open with trembling hands. Inside was a single book, leather-cracked edges curled, the kind of object time tries to forget, but never does. I brushed off the dust. On the cover, faint letters read Henry Hale, and my heart stopped. Henry Hale, the farmer my father had ruined 50 years ago. The name I had tried not to remember, and yet it had been living under my house all along. The diary was swollen from moisture, its pages soft and brown like autumn leaves. I turned each one carefully, afraid that even my breath might erase what was left. The words were plain, almost gentle, a man, recording days of work, hunger, hope. "The soil is tired," he wrote, "but I'll plant again when the rain eases." Then the tone shifted. Midway through the book, the sentences turned jagged, a man cornered, betrayed. "They came today," one entry said. "The Whitmores. They said my debt was due. They took the land my father left me, said it was business. I call it theft." The ink had bled down the page like tears. I could almost hear his voice beneath my fingertips, and then the final line written in shaky strokes. "The little girl with gray eyes. She looked at me with sorrow." She couldn't speak, but her eyes said sorry. I pressed the book to my chest and broke. I remembered that day. The rain, the shouting. My father standing tall, Eleanor at his side, her voice calm, her smile sharp. And me, 13 years old, hiding behind the carriage door, watching as a man begged for mercy. I didn't understand the words, but I understood his eyes. They were pleading, not for his land, for dignity, for justice. And I had done nothing. I had turned away. Now, 50 years later, his words found me. The girl with gray eyes. That was me. The weight of it pressed into my chest until I could barely breathe. I sat there on the cellar floor, lamp flickering beside me, and the silence filled the room like water rising. If you've ever discovered the kind of truth that doesn't forgive, you know the silence that follows. It doesn't scream, it hums, low, constant, unrelenting. "Oh, silence remembers," I whispered, and the cellar seemed to echo it back. "Would you have forgiven yourself? Would you have tried to? Or buried it deeper, like we did with him?" When I finally climbed the stairs, the house felt different. Every creak underfoot sounded like a heartbeat. The walls pulsed with a quiet grief I hadn't noticed before. Ma'am. I placed the diary on the kitchen table next to the music box and Alan's photograph. All of them ghosts that refused to stay buried. Evelyn came in later that night. She saw my face and stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" she asked softly. I turned the book toward her. Everything I said, everything happened before us. She sat down beside me. Her hand brushed mine, and I realized how cold my fingers had become. "He wrote about me," I murmured, "about the little girl who didn't speak." Evelyn looked at me with that quiet empathy only the young can offer. "You were just a child," she said. "You couldn't have stopped them. But guilt has no age. It lives as long as memory does." Later, when she'd gone to bed, I sat alone by the window. The wisteria swayed in the wind, casting soft purple shadows across the floor. I thought about my father, the proud man who taught me literature, but not mercy. I thought about Eleanor, how she smiled in every photograph, always standing in the center, always untouched by consequence. And I thought about Henry Hale, buried somewhere beneath the land my family stole. I whispered his name like a prayer, but prayers don't heal what was built on suffering. They only acknowledge it. Maybe that's what justice really is, not revenge, not repair, just acknowledgement. The lamp's light flickered low, and I felt heat rise in my chest, the kind that comes not from anger, but awakening. It was time to stop inheriting the shame of dead men. Time to speak, even if the words came too late. I took out my journal, the one Alan had gifted me years ago, and began to write. Henry Hale. I wrote your land was stolen, but your story will not be. Each word steadied my breath. Each line gave shape to the apology I never spoke. And for the first time, I didn't feel cursed by my family's silence. I felt guided by it. Because silence remembers, and it was remembering through me. When dawn came, I returned to the cellar one last time. The air was softer now, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. I placed the diary back in its drawer, wrapped it in linen, and whispered, "Rest now. I've read your truth." As I closed the drawer, I felt something shift beneath my hand, a release almost, like the house itself letting go. Upstairs, the music box began to hum again. This time, the melody wasn't broken. It was full, complete. I smiled through tears. The cellar kept its secret, I said softly, but not forever. The wisteria outside trembled in the morning breeze, and I felt peace stir quietly in my chest. Because forgiveness doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering and still choosing to stand in the light. The morning he came back, the light was sharper than usual. It cut through the wisteria like glass, scattering flecks of gold and shadow across the floor. The air felt heavy, the kind that warns of a storm you can't yet see. I was in the study tracing the cracks on Alan's old desk when I heard his voice. Margaret," he called out too smoothly, like someone practicing affection in front of a mirror. The sound carried through the hallway, familiar but hollow. It had been months since the trial. Months since that cold courtroom where he stole my name and nearly my home. And now he stood at my door smiling like nothing had ever happened. Blood. Yes, we shared that. But family, no. That was something else entirely. He stepped inside without waiting for me to speak. His shoes clicked on the wooden floor, polished to perfection the way arrogance often is. "Still here, I see," he said lightly. His eyes scanning the room, lingering on the silver music box, the stack of old files, and the faint scent of lavender that filled the house. He looked around like a man inspecting a property, not a memory. I said quietly, "You've come a long way, Jonathan, to see an old woman you once called incompetent." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I came to make sure you're comfortable. We can still find a way to work together, you know." The word work hung in the air like a lie wearing perfume. I didn't answer. Silence did it for me. Because silence always remembers, and in that moment, it remembered every word he'd spoken in court, every time he'd called me unstable, every way he'd tried to turn truth into madness. He moved closer. "I've spoken with the lawyers again," he said. "There's still confusion about the ownership of the land. If we handle this smartly, we both win." I looked up at him. "My dear," I whispered, "when one side lies and the other side stays silent, no one wins." That was when Evelyn entered. Her footsteps were soft, but her presence filled the room like sunlight through fog. She was holding something small, a voice recorder. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the quiet weight of justice. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "I think it's time you heard this." She pressed play. Static crackled first, then a voice sharp, low, unmistakably his. "Jonathan, Eleanor will need to redo the property documents. Make it look like she signed off before Alan's will. If we can align the dates, no one will question it." Then another voice, my sister's, cool and calculating. "She'll never fight back. Margaret never does." The room fell still. Only the faint hum of the wisteria outside broke the silence. Jonathan's face drained of color. He reached for the recorder, but Evelyn stepped between us. Her voice was steady. "Try anything, and I'll have this sent straight to the court." He froze his jaw tight. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Both of you." I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time, I didn't see my nephew. I saw a frightened boy wearing his mother's cruelty like armor. "No, Jonathan," I said softly. "You'll be the one who regrets never learning how to love the truth." He glared at me, but there was no fight left in him, only shame pretending to be anger. He turned toward the door, but before he left, he spat the last words of "the weak family means nothing to you, does it?" I smiled a quiet, tired smile, not when it forgets what it means. When the door shut, the house exhaled. The air felt lighter, almost clean. I turned toward Evelyn. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her expression was proud, almost radiant. "You did well," I told her. Her lips curved faintly. "So did you." She didn't know how much that moment meant to me, to finally stand firm without shouting, to let truth speak for itself. Heat rose in my chest, not the fury of loss, but the warmth of something reclaimed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small in my own house. That night, I sat by the window, watching the light shift across the wisteria. The blossoms glowed faintly under the moon, pale purple and trembling in the breeze. I thought of Jonathan, the boy who once brought me wildflowers from the garden, the man who returned to take what wasn't his. And I thought of Eleanor, how every lie she planted had grown into him. Our bloodline had been poisoned by greed long before I was born, but maybe I was the one who could end it. I whispered to the night enough. The word carried heat, small but steady like the first spark before dawn. If you've ever had to choose truth over blood, you'll understand. Would you have done the same or let silence win again? The next morning, the sun rose fierce and bright, washing every shadow from the floor. Evelyn stood in the garden, holding the recorder in her hand. The petals of the wisteria brushed against her shoulder, and for a moment I could almost hear the music box humming in rhythm with her breath. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it blooms quietly like flowers opening after the storm. Jonathan didn't return. Not that day, not ever again. But I wasn't angry anymore. I felt lighter, freed from a name that once chained me to shame. As I sat beneath the wisteria light streaming through the vines like forgiveness, I closed my eyes and let the warmth soak into my skin. The house, once a tomb of silence, was alive again, breathing, listening, remembering. Because silence remembers. And this time it remembered truth, not betrayal. I smiled softly and whispered, "When my nephew returned, I finally understood. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does." The light shifted, falling full upon my face. It felt like peace. The storm came in the night. Rain against the windows, wild and endless. The kind that makes the world feel like it's being washed clean or punished. When morning broke, the air was soft gray and trembling. The garden was half drowned, and the wisteria, that proud tangled crown of purple, had finally fallen. Its vines sprawled across the ground like veins, its roots torn open, raw and exposed. I walked out barefoot, the grass cold under my feet. The storm had stripped the air of every lie. Only truth smelled this fresh. And there beneath the roots something glimmered. A small ceramic vase half buried in mud. Inside I saw it a key, tiny, rusted, waiting. The same shape as the lock on the silver music box. I carried it inside with both hands, as though it could shatter the moment I breathed wrong. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that listens. The box sat on Alan's old desk, its lid engraved with the words, "The truth hums beneath the wisteria." My fingers trembled as I turned the key, a faint click. Then a pause so deep it felt like the whole house was holding its breath. And then, music. Claire de Lune. The melody rose hesitant at first, like a memory stepping back into the light after 40 years of hiding. Notes spilled through the air, gentle, cracked alive. For a long time I just listened, every chord pressed against something inside me, a door I had sealed decades ago. Then as the final notes quivered, a compartment in the bass shifted open. Inside was a folded letter and an old sealed document stamped Robert Whitmore, 1974. My breath caught. I opened the document first. It was my father's real will. The land transfer, the family holdings, all of it legal, clean, untouched by fraud. The land had been bought with consent, not coercion. The truth Eleanor had buried was now breathing in my hands. I unfolded the letter. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, the way his study once did. The ink was faded, but his handwriting, I'd have known it anywhere. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you are reading this, it means truth has found you. I know what your sister has done, how she's rewritten my name, how she's rewritten yours. But I couldn't stop her. I was too weak. You were the only one who ever asked why things were the way they were. The only one who saw what was wrong, even when you were just a child." The paper trembled in my hands. "You must understand, I didn't protect you because I thought you were fragile. I stayed silent because I believed you'd be the one brave enough to speak when I no longer could. Only special people carry truth when others bury it." I read those words again and again until the letters blurred. All the years of guilt, the shame I carried for sins that weren't mine, melted into something warmer, something alive. Heat rose in my chest. Not anger this time, something else. Freedom. "Father," I whispered, "I thought you'd forgotten me." But he hadn't. He had trusted me all along. He'd left the truth hidden under roots because truth, like wisteria, always finds a way back to the light. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do, you'll understand this feeling. The quiet release. The breath you didn't know you'd been holding for half a life. Would you have carried it too, or would you have burned it to forget? Evelyn found me hours later, still sitting at the desk, the music box playing on a loop. She stopped in the doorway. "You found it, didn't you?" I nodded, her eyes softened. "What will you do now?" I looked at her, the young woman who had stayed when everyone else left. The one who believed my silence had meaning. I'll set the record straight, I said. Not for revenge, for peace. She smiled, small knowing. That's how truth sounds, you know. Not loud, just steady. Her words lingered. Because she was right. Truth doesn't shout. It hums. As the evening light spilled through the window, I stepped outside. The storm had passed. The air was warm again, the kind of warmth that seeps into your bones and reminds you you're still alive. The wisteria lay in pieces, its blossoms scattered like fragments of old lies finally undone. But even fallen, it was beautiful, its color deeper, its scent stronger. I ran my hand through the petals, and for the first time I didn't see loss. I saw release. I whispered to the earth, enough. The word echoed softly through the garden like a blessing. That night before sleep found me, I wound the key again and let Claire de Lune fill the house. Every note was a pulse, every pause a heartbeat. And in that space between sound and silence, I heard him, my father, as clearly as if he were still there beside me. You were never meant to suffer for my mistakes, Margaret. You were meant to heal them. I closed my eyes, and tears slipped quietly down my cheeks. Not grief, not anymore. Gratitude. When dawn came, I stood by the window, the light pale and forgiving. The wisteria outside shimmered in the morning sun, its broken branches now framing the sky like open arms. Music still drifted softly from the study, the melody that had waited 4 decades to be heard. It wasn't just a song, it was truth finding its voice. And I realized then this was what peace sounded like. Not silence, not justice, but truth at last being played aloud. The first sound after 40 years was my father's confession and my own freedom, because when the music box opened, so did I. The morning of the meeting was still, the kind of stillness that feels like the earth is waiting to exhale. Sunlight slid through the torn vines of the wisteria, casting soft, trembling shadows over the stone table. Petals pale lavender drifted down one by one, landing on the folders I had laid out like quiet witnesses. The garden smelled of damp leaves and old rain. Birds perched on the roof, cautious, as if sensing the gravity of the day. For the first time in months, I didn't tremble. My heart beat slow, deliberate. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about ending the echo of silence. I whispered to myself I invited them back, not to destroy them, but to face what we've all become. And somewhere deep inside, the silence answered steady and knowing. They arrived one by one. Jonathan first immaculate as ever, but his confidence was thinner now, almost brittle. Then Eleanor veiled in perfume and pearls, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Behind them came the lawyer and the notary, silent men with pens that could erase lives. The chairs scraped against the stone, and the sound sliced through the air like a blade. No one spoke at first, only the rustle of paper, the hum of a bee circling the last bloom, the faint creak of the old vines above us. I broke the silence. "Thank you for coming," I said softly. "It's time we set the record straight." Eleanor's smile was polite, the kind that never reaches the eyes. "I assumed this was about forgiveness," she murmured. Her voice carried that old condescension like honey laced with arsenic. I met her gaze. "No, sister, it's about truth." I opened the first folder, the diary of Henry Hale. His words, brittle with time, still carried the weight of our father's sin. I slid it toward her. Eleanor's lips tightened. Jonathan shifted in his chair. Then I placed the next document beside it, the real will of Robert Whitmore and the letter he'd written to me before his death. The lawyer leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he traced the signature. Eleanor whispered, "That can't be." Her voice faltered for once, stripped of control. "It's his handwriting," I said quietly, unaltered, undeniable. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He tried to find his mother's eyes, but she wouldn't meet them. Then Evelyn, standing a few steps away, played the recording, the one we all knew would change everything. Their voices filled the air again. Jonathan and Eleanor plotting, words like forge and inherit and nobody will ever know. The sound echoed through the vines. Even the birds stopped singing. Jonathan stood abruptly. "Turn it off," he shouted. His voice cracked like lightning, splitting the air. I didn't flinch. Instead, I turned to him and said, "You see, Jonathan's silence isn't empty. It remembers everything we bury in it." He stared at me, his face pale, his hands trembling. "You'll ruin us," he whispered. I shook my head. "No, you've already done that." Then softer, almost tenderly, "But you can stop it from spreading." He sank back into the chair, his eyes wet with something between fury and regret. Eleanor, meanwhile, sat frozen, a statue carved from denial. I could almost hear her thoughts racing, the gears of manipulation grinding to a halt for the first time in decades. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "Mrs. Whitmore, this evidence, It cannot be ignored." Eleanor's gaze darted toward him, cold and sharp. "Then perhaps it should be forgotten," she hissed. Her words fell like ice into the warm air, but I felt no chill, only heat, the kind that comes from finally standing in the light. "No," I said, and my voice surprised even me, steady grounded. "Enough." The word hung there, heavy, final, and for a moment it felt like the garden itself exhaled. If you've ever had to say enough to your own blood, you know that pain carries both power and peace. Would you have done the same? Would you have stayed silent? Eleanor rose, her pearls glinting in the sunlight like tiny chains. "You've humiliated us, Margaret," she said. Her tone cracked at the edges, betraying what pride couldn't hide. I looked at her, the sister who had taken everything but never once looked back. "You did that yourself," I whispered. "I'm only holding up the mirror," she faltered. For the first time in my life, I saw her age. The sharpness drained from her eyes, and what remained was something fragile, human. Jonathan spoke next, voice trembling. "What happens now?" I closed the folders, folded my hands over them gently. "We begin again," I said, "not as a family built on lies, but as people willing to live with truth." No one replied, but the silence that followed didn't ache anymore. It settled, calm, patient, almost kind. When they finally left the garden, fell quiet again. A breeze moved through the fallen petals, lifting a few into the sunlight. Evelyn stayed behind, standing beside me. Her voice was soft. "You did it, Margaret?" I smiled faintly. "No, dear, truth did." We sat there for a while, watching the petals drift, until the shadows lengthened across the stone table. The world felt lighter, not healed, but honest. Later that evening, as dusk settled, I walked beneath the wisteria one last time. Its vines, though torn, were already curling toward the light again. Even in ruin, it reached upward. "Silence remembers," I murmured, and this time the words didn't feel heavy. They felt whole. The air was warm, the ground beneath me steady. I looked toward the empty chairs and whispered, I invited them back, not for vengeance, but to see themselves, and perhaps so I could finally see myself too. The wind stirred the vines, carrying the scent of rain and lilac through the night. Peace doesn't arrive with applause. It comes quietly like a sigh after years of holding your breath. And as the last petal fell onto the stone table, I knew this was enough. The morning of the 100th day was golden and quiet. Light spilled across the wisteria, like forgiveness turning each fallen petal into a small coin of light. The house smelled of paper and cedar, and somewhere deep within its walls, the music box played softly, faint, steady, as if reminding me that truth once spoken never dies. The deadline for my father's will ended today. 100 days since the storm, since the confession, since the silence that had haunted this house finally broke its own vow. I stood by the window, the pen in my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision it carried. After all these years, how does one sign away a lifetime of ghosts? Jonathan came just before noon. His voice reached me first, hesitant, uncertain, stripped of all arrogance. "Dear Margaret," he called softly. When I turned, he wasn't the man who had tried to destroy me. He looked younger somehow, as if remorse had peeled away the mask he once wore. He held his hat in both hands. "I came to ask," he paused, his throat tight, "if you could let me start over." His words floated in the air, fragile as dust motes in sunlight. I studied his face, the boy who once ran barefoot through these halls, the man who had turned greed into language. For a long time I said nothing. Silence has its own mercy, and I wanted him to feel it. Finally I spoke. "I don't keep grudges, Jonathan," I said quietly, "but I also don't keep silence anymore." His eyes filled with something raw, not shame exactly, but the first shape of humility. He nodded, and for the first time, I believed he understood. After he left, I sat at the old oak desk. The documents waited. The will, the letter from Father, and a new paper, one I had written myself. I read it once more before signing. It was a deed of transfer. 1/3 of the Whitmore land, the same fields once taken unjustly from the Hale family, would go to the local Land Preservation Trust. The irony wasn't lost on me. We had stolen it in the name of legacy. Now I was returning it in the name of peace. The ink flowed easily, as though the pen had been waiting for this very movement. When the nib left the page, I felt something in me unclench a knot untied after 50 years. Outside, the noon heat shimmered. It wasn't oppressive, just enough to make the air pulse alive and full. I walked to the garden and sat under the wisteria where it all began, where the lies had been buried and the truth reborn. The vines had started to climb again, thin, but determined, reaching for light that didn't ask for permission. I closed my eyes and listened. The hum of bees, the whisper of petals falling, and beneath it all the faint tune of Claire de Lune drifting through the open window. Music, silence, forgiveness. They all shared the same language. If you've ever tried to make peace with the past, you know it doesn't come with applause. It comes softly like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Would you have done the same? Would you have chosen peace over proof? Later that evening, Evelyn came with the notary to finalize the papers. Her eyes sparkled, proud, protective. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently. I smiled. "Yes, it's time to turn inheritance into atonement." She nodded, but there was a sadness there too, the kind that comes when an era ends. As the notary stamped the final seal, a breeze swept through the garden, scattering petals across the table like soft confetti. Evelyn laughed quietly. "Even nature approves," she said. I laughed too, a small sound but real. Perhaps. Or perhaps it's just letting go like I am. That night I wrote one last letter. Not to Jonathan, not to Eleanor, but to myself, to the girl I once was who watched her father cheat a farmer out of his land and carried the shame like a secret bruise. "You did what he couldn't," I wrote. "You spoke when silence was easy. You gave back what was never truly ours. You chose to heal instead of haunt." When I finished, I folded the paper and placed it inside the music box right beside Father's letter. 2 confessions, 2 generations finding their way to grace. As the clock struck midnight, I stepped onto the porch. The night air was warm, that kind of gentle heat that feels like forgiveness touching your skin. Fireflies danced in the garden, their lights flickering between the vines like small wandering souls. I whispered 100 days, and still the silence remembers. But this time it remembered differently, not as burden, but as witness. Not as pain, but as peace. The music box played once more. Each note shimmered through the dark, carrying both guilt and absolution. I smiled softly and said to the night I traded ownership, "For freedom. And that's the truest form of honor I'll ever know." The world didn't change that night, but I did. And that was enough. The morning paper arrived with the wind. It slipped through the gate and landed softly on the porch, its pages whispering against the old wood, as if it carried not news, but closure. The air smelled of jasmine and ink. The wisteria above had begun to bloom again, a wild curtain of purple cascading from the terrace like forgiveness taking shape. I bent down, picked up the paper, and saw my own name printed beneath the headline, "Former teacher age 63, restores her honor through a truth buried half a century." I read it once, then again, not to see the words but to believe them. Honor, after all these years. It didn't come from their approval. It came because I finally stopped waiting for it. A week earlier, Jonathan had returned not with arrogance this time, but with eyes that finally knew what shame looked like. He asked for nothing except the right to tell the truth. "I've submitted my statement to the press," he said quietly. "I told them what I did, and what you forgave." His hands trembled. The proud man I once feared had vanished, leaving only a boy who had finally faced his reflection. I nodded. "That's enough, Jonathan. Not perfect, just enough." He exhaled almost in disbelief. "You really don't hate me." I looked at him for a long time. "Hate is just silence, with heat still trapped inside," I said. "And I've learned silence remembers." He smiled through tears, then left without another word. And for once his silence was not avoidance. It was respect. Eleanor didn't stay to watch it unfold. She packed her pearls, her perfumes, and the last pieces of pride she could carry, and left the town before the article broke. No note, no goodbye, only absence her final signature. I didn't chase her. Some people must live with their ghosts until they're ready to listen to them, and some never will. As I watched her car vanish down the road, I felt no anger, no victory, only stillness, the kind that comes after a lifetime storm finally spends its last drop. If you've ever stood at the edge of forgiveness, you know it's not sweetness. You feel first, it's exhaustion. Would you have forgiven her? Or would you have let the silence do the punishing? Evelyn came that afternoon, a folded newspaper in her hand. She was glowing not with pride, but with quiet triumph. They're printing the truth everywhere, she said. Your story is already changing people. She laid the paper on the table between us. There was my photograph, an old one taken years ago when my hair was darker, and my eyes still carried that naive belief that the world would stay kind. Beneath it, the article spoke of a woman who carried the weight of another's sin and chose to restore light, not revenge. I smiled. That's not how I'd write it. Evelyn laughed softly. Then how would you? I looked at the fading light through the vines and said, a woman finally stopped apologizing for surviving. Later that evening, a boy came to the house, perhaps 10, maybe 11. His clothes were neat, and he held something wrapped carefully in paper. "You're Mrs. Whitmore, right?" he asked shyly. My grandfather was Henry Hale. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The name, after all this time, felt like both wound and healing. He handed me the parcel. Inside was a small silver frame with a photograph, a man standing before a field, his face weathered but proud. He used to tell my dad the boy said that one day someone would set things right. He called her the girl with the gray eyes. My throat tightened. I reached out, touched the photo, and whispered, "He remembered me." The boy smiled. "Dad said to tell you thank you for giving Grandpa his good name back." I knelt so we were eye level. "Tell your father I said it was never about giving anything back. It was about ending the cycle." He nodded, then ran down the path, his laughter echoing through the garden. For the first time, that sound didn't haunt me, it healed. That night, I sat under the wisteria again. The vines had grown stronger, their roots deep, their blossoms fuller. The air shimmered with summer heat, but it didn't suffocate anymore. It warmed, it comforted. Heat at last was no longer the language of anger, but of life returning. I placed the Hale diary on the table, wrapped it in linen, and tied it with a silver ribbon. Tomorrow I would give it to the local archive, a story no longer owned but shared. As I tied the final knot, I realized this was how redemption truly works. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet corrections of the heart. Only special people, my father once said, can carry truth without letting it poison them. For years I thought he meant me. Now I know he meant anyone brave enough to stop lying to themselves. When dawn came, I woke to the scent of rain and lilac. The newspaper still lay on the porch edges, curled from the night air. I picked it up again, not to read it this time, but to fold it carefully and place it among the letters and keepsakes in the music box. Inside, the melody of Clair de Lune began again, soft, almost inaudible. The same notes that once mourned now sounded like a benediction. I closed the lid, took a deep breath, and whispered to no one and everyone at once. Honor isn't something they return to you. It's something you reclaim with truth and the courage to finally say, enough. The wisteria swayed above me, its petals brushing against my hair like a blessing. And as the light poured over the garden, I smiled, because silence at last remembered peace. The first blossoms came quietly, almost shy. 6 months had passed since the last storm, and the wisteria had returned in full glory. Its vines curved over the porch like tender arms, its petals trembling in the morning breeze, soft as old forgiveness, fragrant as memory. The sunlight touched everything gold that day. The windows, the stone path, even the dust looked gentle. And for the first time in years, I woke not to silence, but to stillness. There's a difference. Silence used to ache. Stillness heals. I once believed wisteria bloomed only once a year. But I was wrong. Some things bloom again once you stop asking them to. I walked to the table under the vines. The music box waited there, its silver a little tarnished, its melody still trapped inside like a secret half-remembered. But beside the familiar note, there was something I hadn't seen before, an envelope tucked carefully beneath the lid. The handwriting stopped my breath. Alan Gray. Even the ink carried his calm precision, like the man himself, patient, deliberate, full of quiet storms. I unfolded the letter slowly, the edges brittle with time. His words read, "If you're reading this, Margaret, it means you chose light." I closed my eyes. For a moment, the years dissolved, and I could hear his voice again, steady, unwavering, that gentle baritone that once told me only special people face truth without running from it. I sat there for a long while. The air was warm, but it wasn't heavy anymore. The heat that used to burn now simply glowed. I looked around the garden and realized everything that was once ruined had found a way to grow again, in its own time, its own form. If you've ever rebuilt something from ashes, you'll understand this feeling. Peace doesn't come as reward, it comes as recognition. Would you have opened the letter? Or would you have kept it closed, safe, from the risk of remembering? Later that afternoon, I called Evelyn. Her laughter carried through the phone like sunlight. "I told you," she said, "truth doesn't end stories. It begins new ones." I smiled. "You were right, again." We talked about the foundation papers, the final step, and something I didn't think I'd ever have strength for. I named it the Whitmore Truth Foundation. It would protect the elderly who had been robbed by fraud by family or by the silence they were told to keep. "Justice for the forgotten," Evelyn whispered. "Exactly," I said, "but more than that, dignity restored." She paused, her tone softening. "Alan would be proud of you." I swallowed. "No, my dear. Alan would be proud of the silence that finally spoke." As evening fell, the air shimmered with lavender light. I took the letter, placed it back inside the music box, and wound the key once. Claire de Lune began to play. Its notes seemed to float above the vines as if the sky itself was humming in tune, and with every note I saw faces. Father, Eleanor, Jonathan, even Henry Hale, the man my father wronged. Each of them part of the same web of truth and consequence, each one a note in this melody of reckoning. I whispered, "The truth doesn't die. It only waits for someone brave enough to listen." And I thought of that little boy, Henry's grandson, his laughter echoing through the garden weeks ago. He would grow up in a world where his family's name meant pride again, and mine meant peace. Night came gently with the hum of cicadas and the rustle of vines brushing the window pane. I sat by candlelight, writing the first statement for the Foundation's charter. It began with 12 words. Silence remembers, but truth restores generations. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then I added one more line beneath it. This is for those who were told they weren't special enough to speak. That line was for me, and maybe for you too if you've ever carried the kind of truth that feels too heavy for one heart. If you've felt it, share it. If you've buried it, forgive yourself. Silence remembers, but it doesn't have to define you. By midnight, the candle had nearly melted to its base. The music box had stopped, but I could still hear the melody in the air, as if it had stitched itself into the night. I walked to the door and stepped out beneath the arch of wisteria. The moonlight turned everything silver. Petals drifted across my hair, my hands, my dress, each one a small blessing from the past. I looked up, and for the first time I didn't see grief. I saw continuation. Life doesn't erase what hurt us. It simply grows over it the way vines cover old walls, not to hide them, but to soften the memory. Alan's words returned to me then, "If you're reading this, you chose light." I smiled to the night and whispered I did. The world was quiet, not empty, but full of listening, full of the living proof that truth once freed multiplies. The wisteria swayed, the stars watched, and in that stillness I felt something bloom not from the soil, but from within me. I once thought wisteria bloomed only one season, but I was wrong. It blooms wherever courage takes root. It blooms in silence, in confession, in redemption. It blooms when we stop running from what we already know. I used to think it grew from branches. Now I know it blooms from the heart, because the truth doesn't just save a person. It heals an entire lineage. And as Claire de Lune returned one last time, soft and slow, like forgiveness made of sound, I whispered to the dawn. I once thought wisteria bloomed only one season, until I saw it bloom from my own heart.